Hello to everybody tuning in for Acast Audio Fiction Week. My name is Grace Ross. I'm on the content team at Acast, acquiring new and existing podcasts. We are a global podcast platform that hosts, distributes, and monetizes podcasts around the world. I'm so delighted to have with me today in conversation Kim Yao, who's a literary manager at Echo Lake Entertainment. She and I are going to be talking about derivative rights and IP, especially as it relates to the world of audio fiction. So Kim, I'm so happy to have you. This is such a pleasure. I'd love for you to just speak a little bit about yourself and what you've been working on in the podcast space when it comes to film and television.
Yeah, absolutely. Really glad to be here and having this conversation too. I've worked my entire Hollywood career selling film and TV rights to all kinds of IP, books, graphic novels, podcasts, of course, absolutely. Archive 81 and the adaptation to come on Netflix is one of them that we're really excited about overall. But, also I've been working with the Wolf 359 creators too, and other podcast creators as well. So, I feel like it's a really good time in film and TV to be having conversations about podcasts now that more adaptations are coming out.
Yes, and I will say we're delighted that Wolf 359 is now on Acast and is one of our creator partners, which is very exciting, Kim. And congratulations on the Archive 81 deal with Netflix. It is so exciting. I cannot wait for that to come out. So we'll just start briefly to talk. I'd love to hear you talk about, as you said, like what's working in the market right now when you're looking at kind of podcast adaptations in film and television. Is there a certain category? Are you seeing certain kinds of talent? Just kind of what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, well, I think that genre works really well for adaptations altogether. But the one caveat I would put to that is genre adaptations that would be too expensive, like anything that might be a too crazy space opera on a fantasy planet altogether, I would say would be a little bit of an extra consideration for film and TV. I really think when it comes down to it, and for the podcasts that are working too, it's about having a really good hook for what the series or film could be, and also just characters that are compelling. At the end of the day, regardless of genre, that's going to be the most important always. And so that's something I would really encourage, all creators to continue to focus on.
Which I think is, something we're seeing in the audio world that does really well. But let's talk a little bit about process. I know you mentioned too, what are some of the ways that you kind of are able to, when you're thinking about, an adaptation for a podcast and maybe that has like 60 episodes, right? Or multiple seasons, that's a long show, how do you start to kind of digest that, or how do you work with your clients and how do you work with them to get the pitch in front of, and how does that process work?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that's most important is identifying at what point the series or film adaptation really starts to come together in your mind from listening to the podcast. And like with your example, with when you have podcasts that are 60 episodes long, it's interesting because I think the framework of a podcast when you're talking about audio fiction is that you want to do the slow reveals, right? And it's each layer that gets you continually listening to the next episode to figure out what that next step of the puzzle is. For television, it's actually diametrically opposite in the sense that, like, up front, very quickly, you need to know a lot of different things, where the series is headed, a sense of what's to come, even if you don't have the whole picture. So what I find really helpful in speaking with podcast creators too, in the scripted audio space is, how much does someone need to listen to, and in terms of episodes, to understand what that vision will be for film and TV. And it really varies from podcast to podcast. Overall, for some, it's, you listen to the first few. For others, listen to the first season, etc. But having an understanding of that point is very key, I'd say. And after, really it's finding people in the film and TV space who gravitate to the kind of story that's being told, be it by genre or by what's happening in the plot overall, which comes back to the compelling characters, argument too, which, we really want to create people that your audience is really going to emotionally resonate with too, because whether it's audio fiction or film or TV, that's what keeps us watching and listening.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding that that's really interesting that you talk about kind of that kind of inverted kind of narrative arc, right? When it comes to the two formats. When you're scouting, or when you're in conversations with podcasters, are there things that you wish those podcasters would do when they're putting together materials, or things that you like, kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of how you would give recommendations to maybe an independent creator who's got the successful series and wants to think about kind of what film and television adaptation would look like, or how they'd even approach an agent? Do you have any advice on how they might approach, start to think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's figuring out a way to, especially if you have a long running series with, getting into the hundreds, possibly episodes, a way of really conveying what the heart of the story is going to be. And it doesn't have to be a performative pitch. If anything, I would say it shouldn't be a performative pitch, because what should get a representative interested is what's key and fundamental to what the story is itself. So, one thing I would advise, if podcast creators are thinking especially about, the adaptation potential of their podcast to television, scripted television, that they think about the question of what is the engine of the potential series for television. Because, as even with successful limited series, you want them to come back. That's the hallmark of a great series, is having multiple seasons overall, and everyone can be very happy about that, the longevity of that. And so it doesn't have to be so derivative as saying, well, the engine it's a detective of the week show. There can be, I would say, more nuance to that, but you want to have a sense of what's driving the plot forward and creating opportunities for more plot overall too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's, being able as a creator as well, to kind of think about that, right, as they're talking about their show and what's most important to pull out, I think is really helpful advice. Yeah, and I'd love for you also to just, again, we're still kind of in the process, once, could you also just, again, I think to those podcasters who, who haven't kind of don't have a lot of insight into what happens, right? When they find maybe a literary manager like you, what happens next? Like, what are some of the general next steps that they might kind of expect from, once they kind of find an agent, basically, to kind of rep them?
Yeah, absolutely. It starts with figuring out a plan and ideally that right representative for you will have a plan laid out. And then usually it's sharing with producers overall in the film and TV space, possibly, looping in, I'd say, a writer as well in the film and TV space. But it really depends context to context and project to project. But starting to have those conversations, which will lead to creating a pitch, bringing that to buyers, bringing that to studios, and then going from there. So it's really kind of a process where you continually bring in additional elements overall as you continue down the pathway. And everyone has a very variable length for how long those I would say processes take in film and TV. That's the up and down road of Hollywood, which is so crazy. But when you can get to the finish line, it's all worth it. So.
Oh, absolutely. It's so exciting. And I think, you and I have talked about this over the years, and it's something I saw as a book agent in my previous career. But we always used to say, like, you can't, even if you option, right, or there's a shopping agreement for IP, and you found one of those elements, whether it's a writer to do a script or that you just can't, you have to think of it as pie in the sky, right? That it'll kind of get through the finish line to some extent, because there's so many different elements that can go,
Yeah.
that can happen,
really,
and it can take a lot longer
yeah.
than.
Oh,
than you
definitely. It very
expect.
much is movie and TV magic sometimes, but
Yeah.
when it all comes together, it all comes together. So
I know, like I like everything with Archive 81, which is just fantastic. But I know I want to wrap it up with just kind of a last question about, like, do you have any advice for scripted creators, maybe who are, on both sides, who are even starting out, right, as they're creating their world, and what they should be thinking about, when it comes to kind of film and television, maybe down the line, or any advice about if they, sticking points on contract and negotiation, on things that maybe they should keep an eye out for, but just anything you could offer to kind of.
yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I'd say is, when you're translating mediums between podcasts to film and TV, inevitably just expect there are going to be creative changes. And, I say this to authors that I work with a lot too, where, you're always going to have the story as you told it, in the way that you see it in your heart and your mind, in the podcast. But it might look a little bit different when it's, in its different form for television and film. And I think sometimes that comes when you read a script adaptation of your baby, basically there's a little bit of a shock value in that, and that's okay. It's just different medium, etc. So just be prepared for that of having that moment. And then two, I'd say, if you can hold on to the film and TV rights overall. I say if you can, because more and more people are asking for the film and TV rights overall too. And then the third thing I would mention is just keep creating. Whether it's the first podcast or like the 10th podcast you've created, keep putting stories out there. I think the best thing for the community is for there to be so many more of a wealth of stories out there, so other podcasters can realize what they can do as well. And inevitably, film and TV will have more podcast adaptations, but there really needs to be a strong well to draw from too, and reference points of successful podcasts in the past that have gone through that pathway. And so I think the act of creation will lead us to that point where we see more and more on screen, and that'll be exciting. But if we don't create those opportunities, and if that content isn't created, then we're not necessarily going to get there as fast. So
Yeah, and I think you speak directly kind of to the point of the series of conversations I've been having too, about how important it is to think about, keeping IP and owning kind of at least the original kind of world and the form that you've put it in, and that will give you space and creators space to kind of let other adaptations, right, and run with your idea, which ultimately will kind of drive viewers and audience back to kind of your podcast. So no, Kim. It's just been such a pleasure to chat with you today and to hear kind of your insights. You've just been crushing it, and I am so excited to continue to see all the amazing projects that you've gotten in development. Thank you again for joining us and as part of Acast Audio Fiction Week. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure.